In the vast darkness of space where countless alien civilizations have risen and fallen, there exists a universal truth that every species learns. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They are the storms that give no warning, the earthquakes that strike without tremor, the predators that hunt in absolute silence. When the Zephyrian Empire captured their first human, they expected screaming. They expected begging. They expected the desperate pleas that echoed from every other species they had conquered across 17 star systems. What they got instead was something far more terrifying than any war cry or threat of vengeance. They got silence. But silence, as they would soon learn, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Especially when it belongs to a man whose fists had once been registered as lethal weapons, whose knees could shatter bone like glass, and whose elbows had ended careers with surgical precision. In the underground fighting rings of Bangkok, they called him the Silent Storm, not because he was quiet, but because his opponents never heard him coming. Now, trapped in an alien cell light years from Earth, Marcus Chen would teach his captors that some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Some storms simply arrive, and by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late to run. The galaxy was about to learn why humans had earned their place among the stars not through superior technology or diplomatic finesse, but through something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. The unbreakable will to never surrender, no matter the odds. This is the story of how one man's silence became the war cry that shook an empire. Marcus Chen had been awake for 37 hours when the Zephyrian patrol ship found his damaged escape pod drifting near the Kepler 4-2 system. The merchant vessel he'd been traveling on, the Wandering Star, had been attacked without warning, a common occurrence in this lawless sector of space where human expansion met alien resistance. The attack had been swift and brutal. "Pirates!" the captain had shouted over the intercom, though Marcus suspected something more organized. The way the enemy ship had disabled their engines with surgical precision, the way they had targeted the communication array first, it spoke of military training, not desperate scavengers. Now, as he watched the sleek, angular Zephyrian vessel approach his pod through the small porthole, Marcus kept his breathing steady and his expression neutral. He had learned long ago in the cramped training gyms of Bangkok's underground fighting circuit that showing fear or desperation only gave your opponent an advantage. Whether that opponent was a 200-pound Muay Thai champion or an alien warship didn't matter. The principle remained the same. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic thud that reverberated through the pod's hull. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself the way Master Somchai had taught him 20 years ago. Feel the weight of your body, the rhythm of your breath, the space around you. Know where you are, know what you can do, know what you cannot do. The airlock hissed open, and Marcus got his first look at his captors. The Zephyrians were tall, nearly 7 feet on average, with elongated limbs and pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Their faces were angular, almost crystalline, with large black eyes that reflected light like obsidian. They wore form-fitting armor that appeared to be grown rather than manufactured, organic curves that followed their alien physiology. Human, the lead Zephyrian spoke, its voice a harmonious blend of tones that somehow formed recognizable words through his pod's translation system. "You will come with us." Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 5'9", he was considerably shorter than his captors, but he had learned not to let physical disadvantages intimidate him. In the fighting rings, he had faced opponents who outweighed him by 50 pounds or more. Size meant nothing if you knew how to move, how to strike, how to turn an opponent's strength against them. "I suppose I don't have much choice," he said, his voice calm and steady. The Zephyrian tilted its head, studying him with those dark eyes. "Most species beg at this point, or threaten. You do neither. Would either one change the situation? No. Then why waste the energy? Something that might have been amusement flickered across the alien's features. Interesting. You will come aboard our vessel. You will not resist. You will not attempt to escape. If you comply, you will not be harmed unnecessarily. Marcus nodded once and stepped forward. 2 more Zephyrians flanked him as they moved through the connecting tunnel into their ship. The interior was unlike anything he had ever seen. Walls that curved organically, surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, technology that was indistinguishable from living tissue. They led him through corridors that branched and twisted like arteries, past chambers filled with equipment he couldn't identify. Other crew members stopped to stare at him as they passed. Marcus caught fragments of their harmonious speech through the translation system. Words like primitive and specimen and valuable. The detention area was in the ship's lower section, a series of cells that were formed from the same organic material as the rest of the vessel. The walls appeared solid but yielded slightly to pressure, like dense foam. The cell itself was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with a raised platform that presumably served as a bed and a small alcove that contained what looked like sanitary facilities. "You will remain here until we reach our destination," the lead Zephyrian informed him as the others began to leave. "Do not attempt to damage the cell walls. They are more resilient than they appear, and any damage will result in the release of pacifying agents into your atmosphere." Marcus examined the cell with the eye of someone who had spent years studying confined spaces, not prison cells, but fighting rings, training rooms, the small apartments where he had lived during his fighting career. Every space had its advantages and disadvantages, its opportunities and its limitations. The walls curved seamlessly into the floor and ceiling, offering no obvious weak points. The entrance had sealed itself completely, becoming indistinguishable from the rest of the wall. There was no visible technology, no control panels or monitoring devices, though he was certain he was being watched. He sat on the platform and began to stretch, moving through the routine he had followed for more than 2 decades. Flexibility was crucial in Muay Thai. Not just physical flexibility, but mental adaptability, the ability to change tactics instantly, to find opportunity and disadvantage, to remain calm when everything around you was chaos. Hours passed. The ship's movement was barely perceptible, a subtle vibration that suggested faster than light travel. Marcus continued his routine, stretching, breathing exercises, mental preparation. He reviewed techniques in his mind, running through combinations and counterattacks with the precision of a chess master analyzing positions. The Zephyrians brought him food, if it could be called that, a paste-like substance that tasted of nothing but provided adequate nutrition. They watched him eat with the same clinical interest they might show to a laboratory animal. "What is your designation?" the lead Zephyrian asked during one of these visits. "Marcus Chen." "What is your function among your species?" Marcus considered the question. In his previous life, he had been many things: a fighter, a trainer, a teacher. After retiring from competition, he had opened a small gym in Bangkok where he taught traditional Muay Thai to anyone willing to learn. When the opportunity had come to travel to the outer colonies as a security consultant, he had taken it, drawn by the adventure and the decent pay. "I teach people how to fight," he said finally. The alien's head tilted in that curious gesture. "You are a warrior." "I was. Now I'm more of a teacher." "Interesting. Your species appears physically inferior to most we have encountered. How do you wage war?" Marcus smiled slightly. "With what we have." The Zephyrian studied him for a long moment before leaving without another word. Days passed in a routine of meals, exercise, and observation. Marcus estimated they were traveling for approximately 72 hours before the ship's vibrations changed, indicating they were dropping out of faster-than-light travel. Through the subtle changes in the organic walls around him, he could sense the ship maneuvering, docking procedures beginning. When the Zephyrians came for him, they were more numerous than before, 6 guards instead of the previous 2. Marcus found that interesting. Either they had learned something about humans that made them more cautious, or they were approaching a situation where his security was more critical. They led him through the ship to an airlock, then onto a massive station that dwarfed anything humans had built. The corridors here were wider, the ceilings higher, designed to accommodate multiple species. Marcus saw Zephyrians, but also other aliens, shorter beings with metallic skin, tall creatures that moved like liquid mercury, small insectoid forms that skittered along the walls and ceiling. The detention facility was clearly a major operation, Hundreds of cells lined multiple levels, each containing a different species. Marcus saw beings he couldn't begin to classify, creatures that defied his understanding of biology and physics. The sounds were a cacophony of clicks, whistles, roars, and harmonics that the translation system couldn't even attempt to process. His new cell was larger than the one on the ship, but built from the same organic material. The platform here was more clearly designed as furniture: a bed, a chair, a small table. There was even a window, though it looked out onto the detention facility's central hub rather than space. As the guards left him, Marcus took inventory of his situation. He was alive and relatively healthy. He was being held in what appeared to be a major alien facility, possibly a prison or processing center. His captors seemed curious about humans, but not immediately hostile. They were keeping him fed and providing adequate living conditions. Most importantly, they clearly didn't consider him a significant threat. That was their first mistake. Marcus began his routine again, but this time he was more careful about his movements. He stretched and exercised, but he also tested the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He examined every surface, every joint, every potential weakness. Not obviously, he had learned long ago how to hide his intentions behind seemingly innocent actions. The organic material was indeed resilient, but it wasn't uniform. There were variations in density, places where the structure was slightly softer or harder. The window wasn't glass, but some kind of transparent membrane, flexible but strong. The entrance sealed completely, but he could feel the slight change in air pressure that indicated it wasn't perfectly airtight. Over the following days, Marcus learned more about the facility. Guards came by regularly, some Zephyrian, some from other species. They brought food, removed waste, occasionally asked questions. The rhythm of the place became familiar. Shift changes, mealtimes, maintenance periods when the ambient lighting dimmed. He also learned about his fellow prisoners. The being in the cell across from his appeared to be some kind of reptilian species, about his size but with natural armor plating. It spent most of its time motionless, but Marcus occasionally caught it watching him with intelligent eyes. To his left was a creature that looked like a cross between an octopus and a tree, all flowing tentacles and changing colors. It seemed agitated most of the time, constantly moving, occasionally producing sounds that might have been singing or might have been screaming. To his right was empty space, a cell that had been damaged somehow, its walls scarred and partially reformed. Marcus wondered what had been kept there and what had happened to it. The questions from his captors became more frequent and more specific. They wanted to know about human physiology, about Earth's military capabilities, about human psychology and culture. Marcus answered truthfully when the questions were harmless, deflected when they weren't, and remained silent when silence seemed the best option. "Your species interests us," the lead Zephyrian told him during one visit. "You are small, weak, short-lived. Your technology is primitive. Yet you have established colonies in 17 systems and show no signs of slowing your expansion." "We're persistent," Marcus replied. "So are many species. Persistence alone does not explain your success." Marcus shrugged. "Maybe you should ask someone who knows more about politics and strategy. I'm just a guy who teaches people how to punch things." The alien's expression shifted slightly, a movement that Marcus had learned indicated skepticism. "We have observed your martial arts through your information networks. It appears to be ritualized combat with no practical application. Is that what you think? The movements are inefficient. The targets are impractical. The techniques would be useless against superior technology." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right. Good thing you've got me locked up where I can't inefficiently punch anyone impractically." The Zephyrian stared at him for a long moment, then left without another word. That night, as Marcus went through his routine, he noticed something different. The reptilian being across from him was watching more intently than usual. When their eyes met, it made a gesture with one clawed hand, a quick movement that could have been random but felt deliberate. Marcus copied the gesture. The alien made another movement, then another. It was some kind of sign language, though not one Marcus recognized. But the intent was clear. The being was trying to communicate. Over the next few hours, they established a basic vocabulary through gestures and expressions. The reptilian's name was something that translated roughly to "stone that waits." It had been captured during a raid on its homeworld and had been in the facility for what seemed like months. Through their primitive communication, Marcus learned that the facility wasn't just a prison, it was a processing center. Prisoners were studied, categorized, and eventually sold to various alien factions. Some became slaves, others became research subjects, still others disappeared entirely for purposes Stone That Waits couldn't or wouldn't explain. More importantly, he learned that escape was considered impossible. The facility was located in deep space, surrounded by defense platforms and patrol ships. Even if someone could break out of their cell, there was nowhere to go. Marcus absorbed this information without emotion. In the fighting ring, he had faced opponents who were faster, stronger, more experienced. He had fought with broken ribs, torn muscles, concussions that made the world spin like a carnival ride. The key was never to focus on why you couldn't win. The key was to find the one way you could. As he continued his routine that night, stretching and breathing and preparing, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It was risky, probably suicidal, and would require precise timing and a great deal of luck. But it was a plan. The Zephyrians thought they knew what humans were capable of. They had studied human martial arts and found them wanting. They had observed human technology and deemed it primitive. They had captured a human and found him compliant and non-threatening. They were about to learn why those assumptions were dangerous, because Marcus Chen hadn't just been a fighter. He hadn't just been any fighter. For 7 years, he had been the underground Muay Thai champion of Southeast Asia, the man they called the Silent Storm because his opponents never heard him coming and rarely remembered him leaving. And in all those years of fighting, in all those battles against impossible odds, he had learned the most important lesson any warrior could know. It's not about being stronger or faster or tougher than your opponent. It's about being willing to do what your opponent thinks you can't. The Zephyrians had made their first mistake when they assumed he wasn't a threat. Tomorrow, he would show them their second mistake, assuming that their technology made them invincible. But tonight, Marcus Chen sat in his cell and planned, moving through techniques and combinations in his mind, preparing for a fight that would either free him or kill him. Either way, the silence would finally end. The opportunity came 3 days later, during what Marcus had identified as the night shift rotation. The facility operated on a cycle that roughly corresponded to a 26-hour day, with periods of reduced activity that served as the equivalent of nighttime. During these periods, the number of guards decreased, the ambient lighting dimmed, and the general level of surveillance relaxed. Marcus had spent those 3 days observing, learning, and preparing. He knew that the Zephyrian guards made their rounds every 47 minutes during the day shift, every hour and 12 minutes during the night shift. He knew that the organic walls of his cell had a slight give to them when pressure was applied at specific points, not enough for escape, but enough to suggest they weren't as impregnable as his captors believed. Most importantly, he had identified his target. The guard who brought his evening meal was different from the others. Smaller, less confident, newer to the facility. Where the other Zephyrians moved with the assured grace of experienced warriors, this one showed subtle signs of nervousness, quick glances, hesitant movements, a tendency to stand just outside optimal striking distance without realizing why. Marcus had also noticed something else about this particular guard. Unlike the others who wore the seamless organic armor that seemed to be standard issue, this one's protective gear showed signs of repair. A patch along the left side where the material was slightly different in color, a joint at the shoulder that didn't quite align properly. Weak points. On this night, as the young Zephyrian approached his cell carrying the usual paste-like meal, Marcus was ready. He sat in his customary position on the sleeping platform, apparently engaged in one of the meditative exercises his captors had observed him performing countless times before. His breathing was deep and regular, his posture relaxed, his expression peaceful. To all appearances, he was doing exactly what he had done every other night for the past week. The cell wall dilated to form an opening, and the guard stepped inside. Standard procedure, the opening would remain for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough for the guard to place the meal on the table and retreat. Marcus had timed it repeatedly. 30 seconds was enough time for a Zephyrian to exit safely. It was also enough time for a trained fighter to close the distance and execute a combination of strikes that would disable an opponent before they could react. The guard placed the meal container on the table, the same routine as always. But this time, as it turned to leave, Marcus spoke. "Excuse me." The Zephyrian paused, looking back. "What do you require?" Marcus stood slowly, his movements still calm and controlled. "I've been wondering about something. Your people, the Zephyrians. You're warriors, aren't you? I can tell from the way you move, the way you carry yourselves." The guard's posture straightened slightly, a hint of pride entering its stance. "The Zephyrian Empire has conquered 17 star systems through superior martial prowess." "That's impressive." Marcus took a half step closer, the movement so subtle it seemed unconscious. "I'm curious about your fighting techniques. Are they similar to human martial arts? Human combat forms are primitive and ineffective." The guard's tone carried a note of superiority. "Our methods have been refined over millennia. I'd love to learn more." Another half step. Marcus was now within arm's reach, but his posture remained relaxed, non-threatening. "Could you show me a basic stance, maybe?" The guard hesitated. Protocol clearly stated that interaction with prisoners should be kept to a minimum, but curiosity won out. The Zephyrian shifted into what was obviously a combat position. Legs spread for stability, arms raised in a defensive posture that protected the torso while leaving the limbs free to strike. It was exactly what Marcus had hoped for. "Interesting," he said, appearing to study the stance. "So you keep your weight distributed like that and your arms positioned to block attacks to the center line." As he spoke, Marcus gradually shifted his own position, mirroring the guard's movements while simultaneously placing himself in the optimal position for what came next. To the Zephyrian, it probably looked like a human clumsily attempting to copy an alien fighting form. In reality, it was the setup for a combination that Marcus had practiced 10,000 times. The cell opening was still dilated, 23 seconds remaining, and your vulnerable points would be... Marcus moved as if to point to different parts of the guard's anatomy, his finger tracing the air in front of the alien's torso. The Zephyrian's attention followed the movement, its large black eyes tracking the gesture. 18 seconds. Marcus struck. His left hand shot forward in a lightning-fast jab that targeted the soft tissue just below the Zephyrian's throat. At the same instant, his right foot swept the alien's legs, using its forward-leaning stance against it. The combination was classic Muay Thai. The distraction, the setup, the devastating follow-through. The guard's eyes widened in shock, but it was already too late. Marcus's strike connected with surgical precision, targeting the nerve cluster he had identified during his weeks of observation. The Zephyrian's vocal cords were paralyzed before it could cry out, and its legs buckled as Marcus's sweep sent it crashing to the floor. 15 seconds. Before the alien could recover, Marcus was on top of it, his knee pressed against the damaged section of its armor while his hands found the pressure points on either side of its elongated neck. It was a chokehold adapted for alien physiology, cutting off the flow of whatever fluid served as blood in the Zephyrian circulatory system. The guard struggled, its superior size and strength immediately apparent, but Marcus had positioned himself perfectly. In Muay Thai, leverage was everything. Size didn't matter if you couldn't bring your strength to bear effectively. 10 seconds. The Zephyrian's movements became erratic, then sluggish, then still. Marcus held the choke for 3 more seconds to ensure unconsciousness, then quickly stripped the alien of its equipment. The armor was too large and the wrong shape to fit him, but there were other items of interest. A communication device, what looked like a weapon of some kind, and most importantly, a small cylindrical object that the guard had used to open cell doors during previous rounds. 5 seconds. Marcus dragged the unconscious Zephyrian to the corner of the cell furthest from the entrance, positioning it behind the sleeping platform where it wouldn't be immediately visible. He grabbed the meal container and threw its contents across the floor, then overturned the table and chair to simulate a struggle. 3 seconds. He positioned himself beside the entrance, pressing his back against the wall in the blind spot he had calculated during his days of observation. The opening contracted to its normal size just as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Marcus held his breath, the alien communication device clutched in one hand, the cylindrical key in the other. His body coiled and ready. The footsteps passed by without slowing, the routine patrol right on schedule. Marcus allowed himself a moment to appreciate the irony. The Zephyrians were so confident in their technology and their superiority that they hadn't even considered the possibility of a prisoner overpowering a guard. Their security protocols were designed to prevent escapes through technological means, jamming signals, energy barriers, automated defenses. They weren't prepared for someone who relied on nothing more sophisticated than bone and muscle and the willingness to use them. He waited 5 more minutes, listening to the sounds of the facility around him. The organic walls conducted vibrations well enough that he could hear the movements of other prisoners, the distant hum of machinery, the occasional harmonic exchange between guards. Nothing suggested that his attack had been discovered. Moving carefully, Marcus approached the cell's entrance. The Zephyrian key device was smooth and warm to the touch, with no obvious controls or indicators. He pressed it against the wall where he had seen guards position it before. Nothing happened. He tried different angles, different positions, different amounts of pressure. Still nothing. Either the device required some kind of biometric activation, or there was a technique to using it that he hadn't observed. Frustrated but not defeated, Marcus turned his attention to the communication device. It was more obviously technological, a flat rectangular panel that displayed flowing symbols when he touched its surface. The symbols meant nothing to him, but the device clearly had multiple functions. One section showed what looked like a facility map, another displayed text that was probably status reports or messages. As he experimented with the device, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. The harmonious voices of approaching guards, speaking in rapid, agitated tones. Even through the translation system's processing, he could hear the urgency in their communication. Someone had discovered that something was wrong. Moving quickly, Marcus positioned himself back beside the entrance. If they were coming to check on him, he would have one chance to strike before the alarm was raised facility-wide. After that, his situation would become exponentially more difficult. The footsteps stopped outside his cell. Voices discussed something in low, urgent harmonics. Then the wall began to dilate. The first guard through the opening was the same senior Zephyrian who had captured him originally. It stepped into the cell cautiously, weapon drawn, large black eyes scanning for threats. Its gaze immediately went to the overturned furniture and scattered food, then to the corner where its unconscious subordinate lay hidden behind the sleeping platform. For a crucial split second, its attention was completely focused on assessing the scene. Marcus exploded from his position beside the entrance. This time there was no pretense of conversation or distraction. This was pure combat, fast and brutal and decisive. His elbow struck the guard's weapon arm with a sickening crack that suggested broken bone, while his opposite hand grabbed the alien's throat and used its own momentum to slam it against the cell wall. The second guard was already moving through the entrance, but Marcus was ready. As the senior Zephyrian slumped to the floor, Marcus pivoted and launched himself at the newcomer. His knee came up in a devastating strike that caught the alien in what he hoped was its equivalent of a solar plexus, folding it over and driving the breath from its lungs. Before either guard could recover, Marcus had relieved them of their weapons and communication equipment. The weapons were unfamiliar technology, but the basic principle was clear enough. Point the business end at what you wanted to stop existing. The communication devices immediately began squawking with incoming messages, streams of harmonic speech that the translation system identified as security alerts and status requests. The facility now knew there was a problem. Marcus quickly searched the unconscious guards, finding additional equipment and what looked like identification badges. More importantly, he found a small device that one of them had been using to communicate with the facility's central systems. When he activated it, the device projected a three-dimensional map of the detention area, complete with prisoner locations, guard positions, and security features. The map confirmed what he had suspected. The facility was massive, housing thousands of prisoners from dozens of species. His current location was in Section 7 of Level 3, approximately 2 kilometers from the nearest docking bay. Between him and freedom lay multiple security checkpoints, hundreds of guards, and automated defenses that the map didn't fully detail. It was an impossible escape. No single prisoner could hope to fight through that much opposition. Fortunately, Marcus didn't intend to escape alone. Using the communication device he had taken from the first guard, he began accessing the facility's systems. The interface was alien but logical, and his weeks of observation had given him insight into how Zephyrian technology functioned. Like their architecture and their biology, their computer systems seemed to be grown rather than built, with organic interfaces that responded to touch and pressure. It took him several minutes to navigate through the system's security protocols, but eventually he found what he was looking for: the Central Cell Control System. Every prisoner in the facility was held behind the same type of organic barrier that had contained him, and all of those barriers were controlled from a central hub. The security protocols were sophisticated, requiring multiple authorization codes and biometric confirmations to open even a single cell. But they had a weakness that their designers probably never considered. They were designed to prevent escapes, not to prevent someone from letting everyone else out at the same time. Marcus began working through the system using the authorization codes from the guards' communication devices to access higher-level functions. He couldn't open every cell in the facility. That would require administrative access he didn't have, but he could open every cell in his section. And once those prisoners were free, they could work together to free the rest. As he worked, Marcus could hear activity increasing throughout the facility. More footsteps in the corridors, more urgent communications over the guards' channels. Security teams were being dispatched to investigate the disturbance in Section 7. He had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived in force. The cell control system finally accepted his authorization. Dozens of amber lights on the facility map shifted to green as barriers throughout Section 7 began to dilate. Almost immediately, the sounds from the corridor outside changed. Surprised exclamations from guards, roars and screeches, and harmonics from newly freed prisoners, the beginning of chaos that would only grow more intense as the situation escalated. Marcus quickly gathered the weapons and equipment he had taken from the guards, then stepped out into the corridor for the first time since his capture. The detention area was already in turmoil. Beings of every conceivable description were emerging from their cells, some confused, some enraged, some immediately looking for ways to strike back at their captors. The guards who had been maintaining routine patrols were completely overwhelmed, outnumbered 10 to 1 by prisoners who had nothing left to lose. Stone that waits emerged from the cell across from Marcus's, its reptilian features set in an expression that needed no translation. The being that looked like a cross between an octopus and a tree flowed out of its confinement, colors shifting rapidly across its surface in what might have been communication or might have been pure emotion. Freedom, Stone That Waits spoke in its own harmonic language, the translation system rendering the word with overtones of gratitude and determination. "Not yet," Marcus replied, handing the alien one of the captured weapons. "First, we have to fight for it." As if summoned by his words, a squad of security guards rounded the corner at the far end of the corridor, their weapons raised and ready. They began firing immediately, beams of energy that seared through the air and struck the organic walls with crackling impacts. The battle for the detention facility had begun. Marcus dove for cover behind an overturned piece of furniture, his newly freed allies scattering in all directions as energy beams filled the air around them. Some of the prisoners had no understanding of modern weapons and were cut down in the first exchange. Others, like Stone That Waits, adapted quickly and began returning fire with captured equipment. The corridor became a war zone. Energy weapons discharged in staccato bursts, filling the air with the acrid smell of superheated metal and organic compounds. The walls themselves began to change color and texture where they were struck, some kind of damage response that made the entire area look like a living thing in distress. Marcus found himself back in familiar territory. Not the technology or the aliens or the impossible situation, but the pure essence of combat, the split-second decisions, the constant movement, the need to think 3 moves ahead while reacting to immediate threats. It was Muay Thai on a larger scale with higher stakes and more deadly consequences. A Zephyrian guard broke from cover, advancing down the corridor with systematic precision. Marcus rolled out from behind his barricade, came up in a crouch and fired the alien weapon he had captured. The beam struck the guard's center mass and the alien collapsed without a sound. Around him, the other freed prisoners were beginning to organize themselves. Some species seemed to have natural tactical instincts, while others were clearly civilian populations with no combat experience. But all of them shared one thing in common: the desperate fury of beings who had been caged and were finally free to fight back. The battle raged for 20 minutes before the security guards were forced to retreat. They fell back to defensive positions deeper in the facility, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and most importantly, access to the central systems that controlled the rest of the detention center. Marcus quickly moved to a control terminal that the retreating guards had abandoned. The interface was more sophisticated than the portable devices he had been using, with multiple displays showing facility status, security alerts, and prisoner locations throughout the complex. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The facility housed nearly 10,000 prisoners from more than 50 different species. Most were being held in sections similar to the one they had just liberated, but others were in high-security areas, research laboratories, and what looked like preparation chambers for some kind of processing. More immediately concerning, the facility's defense systems were activating. Automated weapons platforms were coming online throughout the complex, and the external defenses were being reinforced. Even if they could free all the prisoners, the station itself was surrounded by patrol ships and defense platforms that would prevent any escape. But Marcus had learned something important during his years in the fighting ring. You don't fight the battle you want to fight, you fight the battle you have to fight. And sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules entirely. He began working through the facility's systems again, this time looking for something specific. Every space station needed life support, power generation, structural integrity systems, and every system, no matter how well designed, had failure points. As he worked, Stonat Waits and several other prisoners organized the defense of their newly captured territory. The reptilian being had natural leadership instincts, and despite the language barriers, it was managing to coordinate the actions of dozens of different species. "What is your plan, Warrior Marcus?" Stonat Waits asked, approaching the terminal where Marcus was working. Marcus looked up from the displays, his expression grim but determined. "We can't fight our way out. There are too many guards, too many defenses. But maybe we don't have to." He pulled up a schematic of the station's power distribution system, highlighting several key junction points. Every facility like this has emergency protocols. If the main power grid fails, the life support systems switch to backup power. If the backup power fails, the emergency protocols automatically open all containment systems and begin evacuation procedures. Stonat Waits studied the display, its reptilian features thoughtful. "You propose to disable the station's power. I propose to make it look like the station's power is failing catastrophically. The automated systems will handle the rest." It was a desperate plan requiring precise timing and more than a little luck, but it was better than trying to fight through an army of guards and automated defenses. As Marcus began implementing his sabotage, he reflected on how far he had come from the quiet man who had been captured drifting in an escape pod. The Zephyrians had thought they were dealing with a primitive human, someone who could be easily contained and controlled. They were about to learn that some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Some storms simply arrive, and by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late to run. The real battle was just beginning. The power grid of the detention facility was a masterpiece of Zephyrian engineering organic conduits that pulsed with bioluminescent energy, distributing power through the station like blood through arteries. Each junction point was protected by multiple redundancies, fail-safes designed to prevent exactly the kind of sabotage Marcus was attempting. But the Zephyrians had designed their systems to prevent technological attacks, electromagnetic pulses, computer viruses, and sophisticated hacking attempts. They hadn't considered the possibility of someone physically destroying junction points with captured weapons while simultaneously feeding false data to the monitoring systems. Marcus worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, using the facility's own communication network to coordinate a series of precisely timed strikes. Through the captured command interface, he could track the movements of security teams, monitor power distribution patterns, and most importantly, control the flow of information to the central command center. StoneNet Waits had proven to be an invaluable ally. Despite the language barriers and physiological differences, the reptilian warrior understood tactics and strategy in a way that transcended species. It had organized the freed prisoners into efficient teams, scouts to monitor guard movements, fighters to hold defensive positions, and technical specialists to assist with Marcus's sabotage efforts. The tree-like being with flowing tentacles, which had identified itself through gestures as something like wind through leaves, turned out to have an intuitive understanding of the station's organic technology. Its tentacles could interface directly with the control systems, providing Marcus with access to subsystems that would have taken him hours to penetrate through conventional means. Together, they had turned Section 7 into a fortress. The organic walls had been modified to create defensive positions, captured weapons had been distributed among those who could use them effectively, and a communication network had been established using the guards' equipment. But Marcus knew their position was temporary. The facility's security forces were regrouping, and soon they would mount a coordinated assault that the escaped prisoners couldn't hope to withstand. The window for sabotage was closing rapidly. "Status report," Marcus called out as he worked at the central terminal. "North corridor secured. StoneNet Waits reported from its position near the defensive perimeter. 27 guards neutralized, no casualties among our forces, but thermal sensors indicate large group approaching from upper level." Wind through leaves pulsed with rapid color changes that the translation system rendered as urgency. Power Junction 3 compromised. Backup systems engaging. Central command detecting anomalies. Marcus nodded, his fingers flying across the alien interface. The Zephyrians were beginning to realize that something more than a simple prison break was occurring. Security alerts were flooding the communication channels, and he could see on the facility maps that guard units were being repositioned to protect critical infrastructure. "Time to implement Phase 2, he announced. For the past hour, Marcus had been carefully mapping the facility's power distribution network. Like most advanced installations, the detention center operated on multiple redundant systems. Main power from the station's fusion reactors, backup power from emergency generators, and emergency power from what appeared to be some kind of biological battery system. The key was not to actually destroy the power grid, that would take too long and require resources they didn't have, but to make the automated systems believe that a catastrophic failure was imminent. And there was one scenario that every space station feared above all others: explosive decompression. Marcus had identified 17 power junction points throughout the facility that, if damaged simultaneously, would trigger the emergency protocols. The automated systems would interpret the power fluctuations as hull breaches and structural failure, immediately opening all containment systems and beginning evacuation procedures. "Wind through leaves. Can you access the atmospheric monitoring system?" The plant-like being flowed over to another terminal, its tentacles interfacing with the organic controls. Colors shifted across its surface as it worked, blues and greens that seemed to indicate concentration, then rapid flashes of yellow that suggested success. "Atmospheric controls accessed," the translation system announced in its neutral voice. Marcus smiled grimly. "Begin simulating pressure drops in sections 12 through 18. Make it look like micrometeorite impacts." As Wind Through Leaves implemented the atmospheric deception, Marcus coordinated the strikes on the power junctions. Teams of freed prisoners moved through the facility using captured weapons to damage specific components while avoiding the areas that would actually cause system failures. It was a delicate balance. Too little damage and the automated systems wouldn't react. Too much damage and they might trigger a real emergency that would kill everyone aboard the station. The first junction point went down exactly on schedule. Emergency lighting activated in that section, and Marcus could see on the monitoring displays that backup systems were compensating for the power loss. So far, everything was proceeding normally. The second and third junction points followed in quick succession. Now the automated systems were beginning to show signs of concern. Diagnostic routines were running, and repair teams were being dispatched to investigate the anomalies. More security forces approaching from main corridor, Stone that Waits reported. Estimate 40 to 50 guards, full battle armor, heavy weapons. Marcus checked the time. They needed 7 more minutes to complete the sequence, but it was becoming clear that they didn't have 7 more minutes. Fall back to the secondary defensive positions, he ordered. Hold them as long as possible. The battle for Section 7 intensified as the Zephyrian security forces launched their assault. Energy weapons filled the corridor with destructive light, and the organic walls began to smoke and char under the sustained barrage. The freed prisoners fought with the desperation of beings who knew that capture meant death, or worse, that they were outgunned and outnumbered. Marcus forced himself to focus on the sabotage while the sounds of combat raged around him. Junction points 4, 5, and 6 went down in rapid succession. The facility's automated systems were now registering multiple critical failures, and emergency protocols were beginning to engage. Containment breach detected in Section 12, the facility's announcement system declared in harmonic tones that echoed through the corridors. All personnel report to emergency stations. Junction Point 7. The atmospheric simulation from Win-Through Leaves was now showing massive pressure drops throughout the affected sections. The automated systems were interpreting this as hull breaches that threatened the entire facility. Structure integrity compromised. The announcement system continued, its harmonic voice taking on a note of increasing urgency. Initiating emergency evacuation protocols. Junction points 8 and 9 went down simultaneously. Marcus could feel the vibrations through the floor as massive mechanical systems throughout the facility began to activate. Emergency bulkheads were sealing, atmospheric controls were switching to emergency settings, and most importantly, containment systems were beginning to open. The battle in the corridor was reaching its crescendo. Stone that Waits had been wounded. An energy beam had caught it in the shoulder, leaving a smoking wound in its natural armor, but it continued to coordinate the defense with unshakable determination. Other prisoners had fallen, their bodies lying motionless among the scattered debris of battle. But they had held long enough. Critical system failure detected, the facility announced. All containment protocols suspended. Emergency evacuation in progress. All personnel proceed to designated escape pods. Throughout the facility, thousands of cell doors began to open. The detention center's automated systems, convinced that the station was facing imminent destruction, were releasing every prisoner in preparation for evacuation. It was exactly what Marcus had hoped for, and more chaotic than he had anticipated. The monitoring displays showed the immediate results. Prisoners were pouring out of their cells in every section of the facility. Some were confused and disoriented, others immediately began attacking any guards they encountered. Species that had been enemies were forced to work together for survival, while others that had never seen alien life forms found themselves thrust into a nightmare of incomprehensible beings. The Zephyrian security forces, already stretched thin by the battle in Section 7, were suddenly facing thousands of escaped prisoners throughout the facility. Their carefully planned assault ground to a halt as emergency calls flooded in from every level and section. "They're pulling back," Stone that Waits reported, its harmonic voice strained by pain but still strong. "The guards are retreating to secure the command center." Marcus nodded, still working at the terminal. The sabotage was complete, but now came the most dangerous part of the plan, actually escaping from a facility that was designed to prevent exactly that. Win-Through Leaves, can you access the docking bay controls? The plant like being flowed over to another interface, its tentacles working with increasing speed. Its color patterns had shifted to rapid pulses of red and orange, what Marcus had learned indicated stress or urgency. "Docking systems partially accessible," came the translated response. "Multiple ships present, some damaged, some functional." Marcus studied the facility's schematics, tracing routes from their current position to the nearest docking bay. It was 3 kilometers through corridors that were now filled with escaped prisoners, security teams, and automated defenses that hadn't yet been disabled. But they had one advantage now that they hadn't had before: chaos. In the confusion of the facility-wide evacuation, a small group might be able to move through areas that would normally be heavily guarded. "Gather everyone who can move," Marcus ordered. "We're leaving." The journey through the facility was like traveling through a war zone. Corridors that had been orderly and secure hours earlier were now battlefields where species fought for survival with whatever weapons they could find. Energy beams flickered through the air like deadly lightning, while the sounds of combat echoed from every direction. Marcus led their group along routes he had memorized from the facility maps, avoiding the main corridors where the heaviest fighting was taking place. Stone that waits, despite its wound, moved with reptilian grace and cunning, its natural camouflage allowing it to scout ahead and warn of approaching dangers. Wind through leaves had wrapped its tentacles around several pieces of captured equipment. Other prisoners from their section followed, a mix of species that had never worked together before but were united by their shared desire for freedom. They encountered their first serious opposition 2 kilometers from the docking bay. A squad of Zephyrian guards had established a checkpoint at a major intersection, trying to maintain some semblance of control over prisoner movements. The guards were professional and disciplined, but they were also exhausted from hours of continuous combat. Marcus studied the situation from cover behind an overturned piece of machinery. 6 guards positioned to control all 4 approaches to the intersection. Heavy weapons, full armor, good tactical positioning. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a difficult fight. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Wait here," he told Stone that waits, then began moving through the side passages that connected to the main corridor. The detention facility's organic architecture included maintenance passages and utility conduits that the original designers had probably never intended as tactical routes. Marcus had studied the schematics carefully, and he knew that there were ways to approach the checkpoint that the guards wouldn't expect. It took him 15 minutes to work his way around to a position above the intersection. The utility passage he was following connected to the main corridor through what appeared to be some kind of atmospheric recycling system, organic tubes that pulsed with the movement of processed air. From his elevated position, Marcus could see the guards clearly. They were maintaining their perimeter, but their attention was focused on the main approaches. None of them were watching the ceiling. Marcus had spent years perfecting the art of the surprise attack. In the fighting rings of Bangkok, he had built his reputation on striking without warning, ending fights before his opponents realized they had begun. The principle was the same whether you were facing a heavyweight boxer or an alien warrior with advanced technology. He dropped from the ceiling directly onto the nearest guard, driving his knee into the alien's back while simultaneously wrapping his arm around its throat. The impact drove them both to the ground, and the chokehold rendered the Zephyrian unconscious before it could raise an alarm. The other guards reacted quickly, but Marcus was already moving. He rolled behind cover as energy beams seared the air where he had been, then signaled to Stone that waits and the others. The battle was brief but intense. The freed prisoners attacked from multiple directions using their superior numbers and desperate motivation to overcome the guards' tactical advantages. Within minutes, the checkpoint was overrun and the way to the docking bay was clear. The docking bay itself was in chaos. Dozens of ships of various sizes and configurations were berthed along the massive circular structure, while prisoners from throughout the facility fought for access to anything that could carry them away from the station. Some vessels were already departing, their pilots desperate to escape before the facility's external defenses could be activated. Marcus quickly assessed the available options. Most of the smaller ships were either damaged or already claimed by other prisoners. The larger vessels would require crews to operate effectively, and there was no time to organize such cooperation among the dozens of species present. But there was one ship that caught his attention. A sleek, predatory-looking craft that was larger than a fighter but smaller than a transport. It had the organic curves of Zephyrian design, but there were modifications that suggested it might have been captured from another species and adapted. More importantly, it was unguarded and appeared to be fueled and ready for departure. That one, Marcus pointed to the vessel. When through leaves, can you interface with Zephyrian ship systems? The plant-like being pulsed with colors that suggested uncertainty. Possible. Ship systems different from station systems may require time. Time was something they didn't have much of. Even as they approached the vessel, Marcus could see security teams beginning to establish control over other areas of the docking bay. Soon, they would seal off the remaining ships and trap anyone who hadn't already escaped. The ship's hatch opened to wind-through-leaves tentacled touch, revealing an interior that was clearly designed for multiple species. The control systems were a hybrid of technologies with interfaces that could accommodate different physiologies and sensory systems. "Stone that waits, take the navigation station," Marcus ordered as they boarded. Wind through leaves, engines and power. Everyone else finds something to hold on to. As his companions familiarized themselves with the alien controls, Marcus took the pilot's position and began the startup sequence. The ship's systems were more intuitive than he had expected. Apparently, the modifications had included some kind of universal interface designed to be operated by various species. The engines came online with a thrumming vibration that he could feel through the deck plates. Around them, the docking bay was becoming increasingly chaotic as more prisoners attempted to commandeer vessels while security forces tried to regain control. External communications, Stone That Waits reported. Station command demanding identification and authorization. "Ignore them," Marcus replied, his hands working the flight controls. "We're leaving now, with or without permission." The ship lifted from its berth with surprising grace, rising above the crowded docking bay floor toward the atmospheric barrier that separated the hangar from space. Other vessels were doing the same, creating a traffic pattern that the station's control systems were clearly not equipped to handle. As they approached the barrier, Marcus could see the station's external defenses activating. Weapon platforms that had remained dormant during the prisoner uprising were now coming online, their targeting systems acquiring the fleeing vessels. The first energy beam missed their ship by less than 50 meters, its passage lighting up their view screen with brilliant destructive energy. More beams followed as the defense platforms attempted to prevent the mass exodus of prisoners. But there were too many ships, moving in too many directions for the automated systems to target effectively. The Zephyrians had designed their defenses to repel organized attacks by enemy fleets, not to stop desperate individuals fleeing in captured vessels. Marcus pushed the ship's engines to maximum power, feeling the acceleration press him back into the pilot's chair. Behind them, the detention facility was shrinking rapidly, its massive bulk disappearing into the starfield as they achieved escape velocity. "Hyperspace capable," Wind Through Leaves reported, its tentacles interfacing with the navigation systems. Multiple jump coordinates available. Marcus studied the navigation display, looking for options. They needed to get as far away from the facility as possible, but they also needed to reach somewhere safe. And for a group of escaped prisoners flying a stolen ship, there weren't many places that qualified as safe. "Stone That Waits, your homeworld. How far? And what's the political situation?" The reptilian being considered the question, its scaled features thoughtful. 17 light years. Government hostile to Zephyrian Empire. Would provide sanctuary, but travel dangerous through contested space. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through space hoping to avoid recapture. Marcus input the coordinates and engaged the hyperdrive. As the stars elongated and the ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, Marcus allowed himself a moment to process what had just happened. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a prisoner, considered harmless by his captors, locked in a cell with no hope of escape. Now he was free, flying through space with allies from alien species, having orchestrated the largest prison break in what was probably galactic history. The Zephyrians had captured a human thinking they were dealing with a primitive, physically inferior being. They had studied human martial arts and dismissed them as ineffective rituals. They had observed human technology and deemed it crude, but they had missed the most important thing about humans, the thing that had allowed them to survive ice ages and predators, to build civilizations and explore space, to never surrender no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. They had missed the fact that humans were survivors, and survivors never fought fair when their lives were on the line. Marcus Chen had been silent in his cell not because he was defeated, but because he was planning. And now the galaxy would learn what happened when you underestimated a species that had clawed its way to the top of its evolutionary tree through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire was about to begin, and it would start with a single escaped prisoner carrying the news to a galaxy that thought humans were just another primitive species. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The journey to Stone That Wait's homeworld took 6 days through hyperspace, followed by 3 more days of careful navigation through contested territory where Zephyrian patrol ships hunted for escaped prisoners. During that time, Marcus learned more about the galaxy than he had ever expected to know. The Zephyrian Empire, it turned out, was just one of several major powers competing for control of this sector of space. There were the hegemony worlds, a confederation of species that prized technological advancement above all else. The collective, a hive-mind entity that absorbed other species into its neural network. The free traders, independent systems that maintain neutrality through economic necessity and mutual defense pacts. And scattered throughout the contested zones were hundreds of smaller civilizations, species that had achieved spaceflight but lacked the military or economic power to resist the larger empires. Many of these worlds had become client states, trading their independence for protection. Others had been conquered outright, their populations enslaved or relocated. Stone That Waits' people, the Korath, had chosen a different path. They had fought the Zephyrians to a bloody stalemate, then retreated to their heavily fortified homeworld and dared their enemies to try again. For 3 years, the front lines had remained stable, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. "Your escape will change things," Stone That Waits explained as their stolen ship approached the Korath system. "The facility you destroyed was major processing center. Thousands of prisoners, valuable intelligence, strategic resources. The Zephyrians will have to divert significant forces to rebuild and relocate." Marcus studied the tactical displays that Wind-Through Leaves had interfaced with during their journey. The plant-like being had proved remarkably adept at extracting information from captured Zephyrian databases. The detention facility hadn't just been a prison, it had been the central hub for processing conquered populations. Skilled individuals were identified and sold to various factions as technical specialists. Physically capable specimens became slave labor or gladiatorial entertainment. The remainder were used for medical experimentation or simply eliminated as unnecessary. Marcus felt sick as he reviewed the files. Millions of beings from hundreds of species processed like livestock and distributed throughout the galaxy according to their perceived value. The escape had freed perhaps 10,000 prisoners, but there were dozens of other facilities operating throughout Zephyrian space. "The question," Stone That Waits continued, "is what you intend to do with this information." It was a good question and one that Marcus had been wrestling with since their escape. His original goal had been simple survival, get away from the Zephyrians and find passage back to human space. But the intelligence they had gathered changed everything. If the reports were accurate, the Zephyrians were already probing the borders of human territory. Small raids, reconnaissance missions, testing human defenses, and gathering intelligence. It was the same pattern they had followed before conquering the 17 other species in their empire. Humanity was next on their list, and most humans had no idea what was coming. "Wind-Through Leaves, can you access human communication networks from here?" The plant-like being pulsed with thoughtful colors before responding. "Possible, but dangerous. Human space monitored by multiple factions. Communication attempts may reveal location." Marcus weighed the risks. He needed to warn Earth and the human colonies about the Zephyrian threat, but doing so would expose their position and possibly compromise their Korath allies. On the other hand, if he remained silent, billions of humans might face the same fate as the prisoners they had left behind. The decision was made for him when their ship's sensors detected incoming vessels, 3 Zephyrian patrol ships, emerging from hyperspace on an intercept course. Either their escape route had been predicted, or someone had betrayed their destination to the enemy. "How long until we reach the Korath defensive perimeter?" Marcus asked, his hands already moving to the ship's weapon controls. 47 minutes at current speed, Stone That Waits replied, its own claws working the navigation systems. Zephyrian ships will intercept in 12 minutes. The math was simple and unforgiving. Their stolen vessel was fast but lightly armed, designed for reconnaissance rather than combat. The Zephyrian patrol ships were purpose-built warships with heavy weapons and military-grade shields. In a straight fight, they would last perhaps 30 seconds. Wind through leaves, can you access the ship's stealth systems? Colors flashed across the being's surface in patterns that Marcus had learned indicated intense concentration. Its tentacles interfaced with multiple control systems simultaneously, probing the ship's capabilities with organic precision. "Stealth systems present but limited," came the translated response. "Can reduce sensor signature but not eliminate. Will delay detection, not prevent." Marcus studied the tactical display, calculating vectors and possibilities. The Zephyrian ships were approaching in a standard patrol formation, designed to maximize their sensor coverage and prevent their quarry from escaping through hyperspace. It was professional, efficient, and completely predictable, which gave him an idea. "Change course," he ordered. "Head directly toward the lead ship." Stone That Waits turned to stare at him with reptilian eyes that reflected disbelief. "That is suicide." "No," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had faced impossible odds before. "That's misdirection." In the fighting rings of Bangkok, Marcus had learned that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who did exactly what you didn't expect. When everyone anticipated a defensive strategy, you attacked. When they prepared for aggression, you disappeared. When they expected you to run, you charged straight at them. The principle worked just as well in space combat as it did in hand-to-hand fighting. As their ship changed course toward the Zephyrian formation, Marcus activated the communication system. Using the codes they had captured from the detention facility, he broadcast a standard distress signal, identifying their vessel as a damaged patrol ship returning from a reconnaissance mission. The response was immediate. Patrol ship designation unknown. Transmit authentication codes and mission parameters. Marcus smiled grimly. The Zephyrians were efficient, but they were also bureaucratic. Their military operated on strict protocols and procedures, which created predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone who understood how to think tactically. "Authentication codes corrupted by system damage," he transmitted back, requesting immediate assistance with navigation and communication systems. There was a pause while the Zephyrian ships processed this information. During those crucial seconds, their stolen vessel continued on its apparently suicidal course directly toward the enemy formation. "Unidentified vessel, reduce speed and prepare to be boarded for inspection." "Understood," Marcus replied, reducing speed now. But instead of slowing down, he pushed the ship's engines to maximum power while simultaneously activating wind through leaves stealth modifications. Their sensor signature immediately dropped by 60%. Making them appear to be a much smaller vessel moving at a much slower speed. The Zephyrian formation began to adjust its positioning to accommodate what they believed was a damaged friendly ship approaching for assistance. Their weapons powered down, their shields reduced to standby power, their attention focused on preparing for a routine boarding operation. They realized their mistake when Marcus's ship roared past the lead vessel at point-blank range, all weapons firing. The concentrated barrage of energy weapons at zero distance overwhelmed the Zephyrian ship's unprepared shields. The explosion lit up space like a brief star, sending debris spinning in all directions. Before the other two ships could react, Marcus had already changed course again, angling toward the edge of the system where hyperspace jumps were possible. The remaining Zephyrian vessels pursued, but they were now operating with the knowledge that their quarry was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Korath Defense Fleet detecting engagement," Stone That Waits reported. 3 ships moving to intercept Zephyrian vessels. Marcus checked their position. They were still 20 minutes from the defensive perimeter, but the Korath ships were fast and heavily armed. If they could survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive, they might actually escape this encounter. The second Zephyrian ship opened fire, sending streams of energy weapons across space toward their fleeing vessel. Marcus threw the ship into a series of evasive maneuvers, using every trick he had learned about three-dimensional movement and unpredictable trajectories. But their stolen ship wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. Warning indicators flashed across the control displays as systems began to overheat and fail under the stress of combat maneuvering. Hull breach in cargo section. Wind through leaves reported its colors shifting to urgent reds and oranges. Atmospheric systems compensating but damage increasing. The third Zephyrian ship had maneuvered to cut off their escape route, forcing them into a running battle with two well-armed opponents. Energy beams filled the space around them, and their stolen vessel shuddered with each near miss. Marcus found himself back in familiar territory, outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting for survival against superior opponents. But he had learned something important during his years in the fighting ring. In a desperate situation, the winner was often determined not by strength or skill, but by willingness to take risks that no sane person would consider. Wind through leaves, how much power can you divert from life support to the weapons? The plant-like being's tentacles worked frantically across the control interfaces, 70% possible for short duration, atmospheric reserve sufficient for 14 minutes. Do it, Marcus ordered. Stone that waits, target the engine section of the nearest ship. All weapons sustain fire, everything we've got. It was a desperate gamble. By diverting power from life support, they were betting their lives that they could disable one of the pursuing ships before their own vessel's atmosphere ran out. But it was their only chance. Their ship's weapons blazed with renewed intensity, sending concentrated streams of energy toward the second Zephyrian vessel. The enemy ship's shields flared and sparked under the unexpected barrage, and Marcus could see their return fire wavering as the ship's system struggled to cope with the damage. Then the Korath reinforcements arrived. 3 sleek warships dropped out of hyperspace directly between the fleeing prisoners and their pursuers. Marcus got his first look at Korath military technology, ships that combined organic curves with angular weapon arrays, vessels that looked like they had been grown rather than built but bristled with clearly lethal armaments. The battle was over in minutes. The Zephyrian ships, caught between their original target and the arriving reinforcements, found themselves hopelessly outgunned. One tried to flee and was destroyed before it could escape. The other surrendered and was taken into custody along with its crew. As their damaged ship limped toward the Korath homeworld under escort, Marcus reflected on what they had accomplished. They had not only escaped from the most secure prison facility in the galaxy, they had struck a blow against the Zephyrian war machine and brought valuable intelligence to potential allies. But more importantly, they had demonstrated something that would soon become legend throughout the galaxy. They had shown that humans didn't surrender, didn't break, and didn't accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The Korath homeworld was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The planet's surface was dominated by massive crystalline formations that served as both natural defenses and architectural foundations. Cities were built into and around these crystal spires, creating a landscape that was part geology and part engineering marvel. The Korath themselves were impressive, larger than humans but smaller than Zephyrians, with natural armor that could deflect energy weapons and claws that could tear through metal. They were a warrior species, but one that had learned to combine individual combat prowess with sophisticated military technology. Marcus, Stone That Waits, and Wind Through Leaves were brought before the Korath High Command, a council of scarred veterans who had been fighting the Zephyrian Empire for longer than most species had known about spaceflight. The human who broke the Zephyrian detention facility, the council leaders spoke, its words translated through devices that had been adapted for multiple species. Your reputation precedes you. My reputation? The story has spread throughout the contested zones, a human prisoner captured and thought harmless who single-handedly orchestrated the largest escape in galactic history. The Zephyrians are calling you the Silent Storm, the human who strikes without warning. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The nickname that had followed him through the fighting rings of Bangkok had somehow traveled across light years to reach an alien species on the far side of the galaxy. The intelligence you have provided is valuable, another council member continued. Confirmation of Zephyrian expansion plans, facility locations, fleet dispositions. This information will save thousands of lives. But that's not why we're really here, the leader added. We want to discuss your species and what role humanity might play in the coming war. Marcus leaned forward. What do you mean? The Zephyrians have conquered 17 species through superior technology and overwhelming force, but you have demonstrated something different. The ability to win through adaptability, cunning, and sheer determination to survive. These are qualities that could change the balance of power in this conflict. Over the following hours, Marcus learned about the true scope of the galactic political situation. The Zephyrian Empire was expanding rapidly, but they weren't the only threat. The collective was absorbing entire systems into its hive mind, while the hegemony was conducting technological experiments that bordered on genocidal. In the middle of this chaos, smaller species were being crushed or absorbed, their unique cultures and capabilities lost forever. The Korath and a few other civilizations had formed a loose alliance to resist the major powers, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. What we need, the council leader explained, is allies who can think differently, fight differently, survive differently. Your escape has shown us that humans might be exactly what we're looking for. Marcus considered the proposal carefully. Getting involved in a galactic war wasn't something he could decide alone. It would require approval from Earth's government and the colonial administrations. But the intelligence he had gathered made it clear that humanity was already targeted for conquest. The question wasn't whether they would be involved in the war, but whether they would fight as allies with preparation time or as victims taken by surprise. I need to contact my government, he said finally. They need to know what's coming, and they need to understand what they're really facing. The council leader gestured with what might have been approval. We can provide secure communication to human space, but understand that once this knowledge spreads, there will be no going back. Your species will be committed to this conflict whether you choose it or not. As Marcus prepared his message to Earth, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a retired fighter teaching martial arts in a small gym, content to live quietly and train the next generation of students. Now he was about to start a war. But as he began composing his report, Marcus reflected on the most important lesson he had learned during his captivity. Sometimes the only way to achieve peace was to be so dangerous that your enemies chose not to fight you. The Zephyrians had made the mistake of thinking humans were weak because they were small, primitive because their technology was less advanced, harmless because they appeared peaceful. Soon the entire galaxy would learn the truth about humanity, and they would understand why, in the fighting rings of Bangkok, they had called Marcus Chen the Silent Storm, not because he was quiet, but because his opponents never heard him coming until it was already too late. The legend was just beginning. 3 months after Marcus Chen's message reached Earth, the galaxy was a very different place. The quiet human who had been captured drifting in an escape pod was now the most wanted individual in Zephyrian space, with a bounty on his head that exceeded the gross domestic product of most planetary systems. But Marcus Chen was no longer just one man. He had become something far more dangerous. He had become an idea. The story of his escape had spread through the underground networks that connected oppressed species throughout the galaxy. Told in 100 different languages and adapted to 1,000 different cultural contexts, the tale had taken on mythic proportions. The silent human who had walked into a maximum security facility and walked out with 10,000 prisoners, the primitive fighter who had outsmarted advanced alien technology, the teacher who had become a general. Earth's response had been swift and decisive. Within weeks of receiving Marcus's intelligence, human military forces had mobilized throughout the 17 colonial systems. But more importantly, humanity had done something that surprised every alien government that had been watching their expansion. They had reached out to other species. The Terran Diplomatic Corps, established hastily but with typical human efficiency, had made contact with dozens of civilizations throughout the contested zones. They offered technology transfers, mutual defense pacts, and something that no major galactic power had ever provided, genuine partnership instead of domination. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the TSF Resilience, watching the combined human-alien fleet conduct maneuvers in the space above Korath Prime. 60 ships from 7 different species working together with coordination that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The fleet itself was a testament to human adaptability. Korath warships with their crystalline armor had been fitted with human sensor arrays and communication systems. Aquatic Nereid vessels designed for deep space reconnaissance now carried human engineers who had improved their stealth capabilities by 300%. Even Wind Through Leaves people, the photosynthetic Sylvani, had contributed living ships that could repair themselves and grow additional weapons as needed. The Zephyrian Empire is requesting negotiations. Admiral Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, announced as she joined Marcus at the observation window. The Admiral was a small, intense woman who had risen through the ranks of the Terran Space Force through sheer competence and an absolute refusal to accept defeat.
"What kind of negotiations?" Marcus asked.
"Conditional surrender of human colonial territories in exchange for withdrawal from contested zones. They're offering to recognize Earth's sovereignty over our core systems if we abandon our colonial expansion and cease support for resistance movements." Marcus smiled grimly. In other words, they want us to go back to being insignificant while they finish conquering everyone else. "That's my read on the situation," Admiral Chen agreed. "The diplomatic corps is divided, but most of them think we should at least listen to the offer." Marcus turned from the window to face her. "What do you think?" "I think they're afraid," she said bluntly. 6 months ago, they had never heard of humans. Now we've disrupted their expansion plans, cost them a major facility, and created the first successful multi-species alliance in this sector's history. They're offering us terms because they're not sure they can beat us militarily. That was the assessment that Marcus had reached as well. The Zephyrian Empire was powerful, but it was also overextended. They had conquered 17 species through superior technology and overwhelming force, but their military was designed to fight conventional wars against opponents who played by established rules. Humans, as the galaxy was learning, didn't always play by the rules. "There's something else," Admiral Chen continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that the collective is mobilizing for a major expansion. If the Zephyrians and humans exhaust each other in a prolonged war, we might both find ourselves facing assimilation by a hive mind." Marcus nodded. It was a consideration that had been weighing heavily on the Alliance's strategic planners. The collective absorbed entire species into its neural network, eliminating their individual identity in favor of unified consciousness. Unlike the Zephyrians, who at least allowed conquered populations to maintain their cultural identity as slaves, the collective simply erased them entirely. "Status report on the training programs?" he asked. Admiral Chen's expression brightened slightly, beyond our most optimistic projections. "We've got Korath warriors learning human small unit tactics, human Marines training with Nereid deep space combat specialists, and Sylvani biotechnicians working with our engineers to develop hybrid technologies." The training programs had been Marcus's idea based on his experiences in the detention facility. Every species had unique capabilities and perspectives that could be valuable in the right context. The key was learning to combine those capabilities effectively instead of trying to force everyone to fight the same way. The Korath, for example, were natural close-quarters combatants with armor that could deflect energy weapons. But they had never learned to coordinate their individual prowess into large unit tactics. Human military doctrine, with its emphasis on teamwork and adaptability, had transformed them into a devastating force. The Nereid were aquatic beings who could survive in vacuum and had evolved sophisticated spatial awareness in three-dimensional environments. Combined with human engineering and tactics, they had become the best aerospace pilots in known space. The Sylvani could interface directly with organic technology and had an intuitive understanding of biological systems. Working with human scientists, they were developing weapons and defenses that conventional technology couldn't match. There's been a development in the Marcus Chen situation, Admiral Chen added, her tone becoming more serious. Marcus raised an eyebrow. The Marcus Chen situation? That's what the intelligence services are calling it. Your escape has inspired resistance movements throughout Zephyrian space. There have been uprisings on 12 worlds, 3 more facility breaks, and what amounts to a civil war in the outer territories. The Zephyrians have had to recall 20% of their frontier forces to deal with internal security problems. Marcus felt a complex mix of pride and responsibility. He had known that his escape would have consequences, but he hadn't anticipated the scale of the reaction. Millions of beings were now in open rebellion against their oppressors, and many of them would die in the fighting. But that's not the important development, Admiral Chen continued. The important development is that they've put together a task force specifically to hunt you down. 3 heavy cruisers, a dozen destroyer escorts, and their best special operations team. They're calling it Silent Storm Protocol. Marcus couldn't help but laugh at that. They named a military operation after a Bangkok fighter's ring name? Apparently, your reputation has grown considerably. The Zephyrian military considers you a strategic threat equivalent to an entire battle fleet. They've analyzed every recording they could find of your escape, studied human martial arts, and concluded that you represent a new type of warfare that their existing doctrines can't counter. That was probably true, Marcus reflected. The Zephyrians had built their empire through technological superiority and disciplined military formations. They understood how to fight other advanced civilizations with similar approaches to warfare. But they had no experience dealing with an opponent who improvised, adapted, and refused to follow established patterns.
They're also offering a separate bounty for information about human military capabilities, Admiral Chen added.
Specifically, they want to know if all humans fight like you do. And what's the answer to that question? Admiral Chen smiled. That's classified information that I can't share with a civilian consultant. Marcus grinned back. I'm not sure civilian is the right word for someone with my current job description. His official title was Special Advisor for Cross-Species Combat Integration, but his actual role was more complex. He trained human soldiers in alien fighting techniques, taught alien warriors human tactics, and served as a bridge between species that had never worked together before. More importantly, he had become a symbol. The human who had walked into an alien prison and walked out with an army. The fighter who had turned a desperate escape into a galactic revolution. The teacher who had shown the galaxy that cooperation was stronger than conquest. Speaking of your job description, Admiral Chen said, we've received a request for a personal meeting. The Silvani want to formally invite you to visit their homeworld. Marcus was intrigued. The Silvani were perhaps the most mysterious members of their alliance, a photosynthetic species that communicated through color changes and had technology that was more grown than built. They had been invaluable allies, but they remained largely incomprehensible to most humans. What kind of meeting? They want to discuss something they call the deep growing. Our xenobiologists think it might be a form of accelerated evolution, but the translation software is having trouble with the concepts involved. Before Marcus could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The observation deck's windows immediately polarized to protect against weapons fire, while emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow. Admiral Chen to the bridge, the ship's communication system announced. Priority Alpha alert. Zephyrian task force detected on approach vector. Admiral Chen was already moving toward the emergency lift. Looks like they found us sooner than expected. Marcus followed her to the bridge where the ship's crew was rapidly preparing for combat. The main display showed a tactical plot of the surrounding space, with dozens of friendly contacts representing the Allied fleet and 3 large red symbols approaching from the edge of the system. Report, Admiral Chen ordered as they reached the command stations. Zephyrian Task Force 3 heavy cruisers and escorts emerged from hyperspace 18 minutes ago, the tactical officer reported. They're broadcasting demands for the surrender of the individual known as Marcus Chen. The Nereid fleet commander suggests a fighting withdrawal to draw them into the asteroid field. The Silvani are requesting permission to deploy what they call growth weapons. Marcus studied the tactical display. 3 heavy cruisers were formidable opponents, but the Allied fleet outnumbered them significantly. The question was whether the diverse alliance could coordinate effectively against an enemy that specialized in defeating organized opponents. "What are the Zephyrians demanding specifically?" Marcus asked. "Unconditional surrender of the human Marcus Chen for transport to Zephyrian space and dissolution of the human-alien alliance," the communications officer replied. "They're offering safe passage for all other personnel in exchange for compliance. They really do think this is all about one person." "Is it?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered the question seriously. His escape had certainly been the catalyst for recent events, but the underlying conditions had existed long before he was captured. Species throughout the galaxy had been waiting for an opportunity to resist their oppressors. He had simply provided a demonstration that resistance was possible. "No," he said finally. "This is about something much larger than me." Admiral Chen nodded and turned to the communication station. "Open a channel to the Zephyrian fleet." The main display shifted to show the angular face of a senior Zephyrian officer, its black eyes reflecting the bridge lighting with obsidian intensity. "I am Admiral Chen of the Terran Space Force," she announced. "Your demands are rejected. The human Marcus Chen is under the protection of the Allied Defense Coalition, and this alliance will not be dissolved at the demand of an imperial aggressor." The Zephyrian's expression shifted in what might have been surprise or anger. "You would sacrifice your entire fleet for one individual?" "We would sacrifice our entire fleet for the principle that individuals have the right to determine their own fate," Admiral Chen replied. "But I don't think it will come to that. You are outnumbered and outgunned," the alien admiral stated. "Your primitive technology cannot stand against Zephyrian military superiority." Marcus stepped forward, moving into the communication pickup's range. "That's the same thing your guard said right before I walked out of your prison." The Zephyrian's attention focused on him with laser intensity. "Marcus Chen, the Silent Storm, you have caused considerable disruption to Imperial operations." "I had some help," Marcus replied. "Turns out there are a lot of species in the galaxy who don't appreciate being conquered and enslaved. Your resistance is futile. The Empire has defeated 17 species with superior technology and military doctrine. Your small alliance will be crushed like all the others." Marcus smiled. "You know what I learned during my years in the fighting ring. The most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't fight the way you expect them to. You've studied human martial arts and decided they're ineffective against superior technology, but you miss the most important part, which is, it's not about the techniques, it's about the mindset. Humans don't surrender, we don't break, and we don't fight fair when our survival is at stake. And now we've taught that mindset to every species in this alliance." The Zephyrian admiral's expression hardened. "Then you will all die together." The communication channel closed, and the tactical display immediately showed the enemy ships accelerating toward the Allied fleet. But instead of panic or confusion, Marcus heard something that filled him with pride. The calm, professional voices of beings from 7 different species coordinating their response with the precision of a single organism. "Korath Battle Group, prepare for close engagement," Admiral Chen ordered. "Nereid Squadrons, flanking Maneuver Alpha 7. Sylvani vessels, deploy growth weapons on my command." "Admiral," the tactical officer called out, "the Zephyrian formation is exactly what we anticipated. They're approaching in standard Imperial assault formation, maximum firepower concentration." Marcus nodded. "They're fighting the way they always fight, against opponents who fight the way they always fight, but we're not going to do what they expect." The battle began with the Korath ships charging directly at the Zephyrian formation, exactly as Imperial doctrine predicted that a warrior species would respond to a challenge. The Zephyrian heavy cruisers opened fire with concentrated energy barrages, their weapons designed to overwhelm defensive shields through sheer destructive power. But as their beams reached the position where the Korath ship should have been, they found nothing but empty space. At the last possible moment, the Korath vessels had split their formation, using human-designed maneuvering protocols to scatter in directions that conventional tactical doctrines said were impossible. Instead of a head-on collision, the Zephyrian fleet found itself surrounded by smaller, faster ships that were attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. The Nereid squadron struck next, emerging from the asteroid field where they had been hiding and using their superior maneuverability to target the Zephyrian escort ships. Their attacks were perfectly coordinated, focusing fire on specific systems to disable rather than destroy, a human tactical innovation that maximized the effect of limited firepower. But the real surprise came when the Sylvani vessels deployed their growth weapons. Marcus had never seen anything like it. The organic ships literally blossomed, extending tendrils and pods that released clouds of what looked like spores into space. When those spores made contact with the Zephyrian ships, they immediately began to grow, spreading across hulls and interfacing with technological systems. Within minutes, the enemy ships were covered in organic growths that disrupted their weapons, compromised their shields, and interfered with their navigation. It was biological warfare on a scale that no one had ever imagined, turning the Zephyrians' own technological superiority against them. The battle was over in less than an hour. 2 of the heavy cruisers surrendered when their systems became completely compromised by Sylvani biogrowth. The third attempted to flee and was disabled by combined Korath human boarding parties that had trained specifically for multi-species assault operations. As the Allied fleet took custody of their prisoners and salvaged the disabled ships, Marcus found himself thinking about how far they had all come. 6 months ago, these species had never worked together. Today, they had achieved a level of tactical coordination that surpassed anything in the historical record. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving messages from throughout the galaxy. News of the battle is spreading on all frequencies." Admiral Chen nodded. "What's the reaction?" "Mixed but trending positive. 17 resistance movements have announced formal declarations of independence from their imperial occupiers. The hegemony has issued a statement of neutrality. The free traders are requesting formal diplomatic contact." "And the Zephyrians?" "No official response yet, but intelligence intercepts suggest significant debate within their high command. Some factions are calling for massive retaliation, others are advocating for negotiated settlement." Marcus wasn't surprised. The Empire had built its power on the assumption that superior technology and overwhelming force could defeat any opposition. Today's battle had shattered that assumption by demonstrating that cooperation and adaptability could overcome technological advantages. "There's one more thing," the communications officer added. "We're receiving a priority message from Earth. The Terran Senate has voted unanimously to ratify the Allied Defense Coalition Treaty. Humanity is officially committed to this alliance." Marcus felt a surge of pride and relief. The decision meant that Earth's government understood the stakes involved and was willing to commit fully to the galactic struggle for freedom. It also meant that the alliance now had the full resources of human space available for the ongoing conflict. But more importantly, it meant that the idea he represented, that cooperation was stronger than conquest, that diversity was more valuable than uniformity, had taken root not just among alien species, but within humanity itself. "Admiral Chen," he said quietly, "I think it's time to take this fight to the Empire's core systems." She looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That would be a significant escalation. Are you sure we're ready?" Marcus thought about the beings he had fought alongside. Stone that waits with its unshakable courage, wind through leaves with its intuitive understanding of living systems, the Nereid pilots with their supernatural spatial awareness, the human marines who had learned to adapt alien fighting techniques to their own instincts. "They called me the Silent Storm because they never heard me coming," he said. "But this isn't about me anymore. This is about something much larger. A storm that includes every species that refuses to surrender to tyranny, and that storm is ready to announce itself to the galaxy." 6 months ago, Marcus Chen had been a prisoner, considered harmless by his captors, locked in a cell with no hope of escape. Now he stood on the bridge of a starship, surrounded by allies from across the galaxy, watching as the largest multi-species fleet in recorded history prepared to carry the message of freedom to every corner of the Zephyrian Empire. The Zephyrians had captured a human thinking they were dealing with a primitive, physically inferior being. They had studied human martial arts and dismissed them as ineffective rituals. They had observed human technology and deemed it crude, but they had missed the most important thing about humans, and now, about the alliance they had helped to create. They had missed the fact that some things were worth fighting for no matter the odds. The galaxy was about to learn that lesson in full measure. The silent storm had become a hurricane, and it was heading straight for the heart of an empire that had never known defeat. Soon they would understand why, throughout human history, the most dangerous words any tyrant could hear were simple and unmistakable. "We will not surrender." Mocked in an alien cell, the human stayed silent until they learned he was a Muay Thai legend, HFY Sci-Fi.